Hey everybody, it is Saturday morning. I just got the lights turned on down here in the fish room, and we are going to take a short impromptu trip around the world. So we're going to start with my waterfall tank, and it basically needs a little more maintenance, as it often does now that I've got so much of this hair algae growing in here. It's starting to make the water flow into places I don't want it to flow, and we're getting some water splashing over here onto the right side, and that will often cause me to eventually start having leaks in the aquarium, or leaks in the waterfall rather, leaks from behind through all of the foam that it's made out of. So far we don't have any leaks, but I need to get in there and clear out some of that algae to make sure the water flows where I want it to flow. Other than that, fish keeping wise, we finally lost the German blue angelfish that I had in this tank. It had been getting old, and I've been watching it for weeks and weeks now just sort of fade away, and yesterday it finally took its last, well, we'll say we took its last breath, you know what I mean? But yesterday I was able to finally get rid of it, and said we no longer have the German blue angelfish in this tank. Otherwise, everything else is still fine. Probably will be getting in here and doing a water change in the near future. I've got a product on the way. It's a medication, but that product also kills hair algae. So I'm almost tempted to put some of it in this tank as an experiment, just to see what happens to all the copious amounts of hair algae I have in this tank. But that's just something I'm thinking about. We'll have to wait and see when I get the medication to decide whether or not I do anything with that. My little foot tank right here is still just ticking over like a clock. I am actually going to be messing with this tank very soon. I ordered another one of those fluid transfer pumps. I can't really do a water change on this tank since it sits on the floor. There's no real way to siphon the water out. I can scoop water out, but I can't siphon water out. And in this case, you can see I've got, you know, several inches of mulm. All of this dark stuff here is just mulm sitting on the bottom of the tank, and there's a lot of it in there. And while I think that's doing a world of good in the tank, in fact, if you look at the pump in the back, you can see the pump is almost completely submerged in the mulm. It just looks like the hose goes down into the mulm on the bottom, but there's actually the pump in there pumping the water up to the top, which causes it to flow back down. And of course, that's a very, very restricted amount of flow, considering the pump is completely submerged in all of that mulm. So we will be getting in there when I get my little fluid transfer pump, and we will be vacuuming a lot of that out of there, which will probably have catastrophic results in the tank and probably throw the tank all out of whack and everything else. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, and it will be an interesting experiment to see what actually happens when we get in there and do that. Overall, this whole sort of waterfall system setup is probably going to be fairly short-lived. I'm thinking I'm winding it down. I've had it here for years and years now, and while it is pretty much a staple of my channel and a staple of my fish room, you walk in, I mean, it's kind of hard to miss the waterfall in the middle of the room. But I think I'm ready for something else, and this is moldy, and it leaks on me if I don't maintain it properly, and it was fun, but I think it's run its course, and we're kind of thinking about something new. So don't know what that's going to be yet, but we're thinking of something new. So make sure you subscribe, you won't miss that or anything else I got coming up. So let's go ahead and move on from the waterfall tank, and we'll come over here to my 29 miscellaneous. So I just did some maintenance on this tank not too long ago. We got a water change, I got the glass wiped down, put some new filters in there, and that's about it. So it looks beautiful, but not a whole lot of change. I will say though, I was asked about some guppies last night on my Friday night live stream, and I pointed out how I do still have a few of these platinum guppies left. These are several years old now, and I'm actually kind of wondering how I still have guppies that are so many years old. Guppies should only live 2 or 3 years, and this one's got to be close to that. I've lost all the other platinum guppies I have, unless there's any left in my waterfall tank. I actually didn't even bother to look in there and check. I think there might be at least one left in there, but either way, these guppies are really, really old, and it's surprising that I've had them so long. That, of course, is my angelfish. Always hides in the corner. Maybe if I do a little splash with my finger in the middle. It'll think there's some food in there and come out. And we'll get a little bit better look at this angelfish. This is another one of the really, really beautiful angelfish I got from PetSmart for just a few dollars. It's no special breed or special coloration or anything, but it just has this beautiful shiny silver body with some traces of blue in it, and then it's got all that black tracery around its fins and eyes. It's just an absolutely gorgeous angelfish. Love this one. Otherwise, this of course is one of my most stable tanks. It just sits there ticking over, and we never really have much to say about that one. So moving on to my 55-gallon Gourami tank, I am able to finally get over here with a little slightly better camera and get some better images of my gouramis. I often talk about this tank, and we look at it quite frequently on my live streams. I do a live stream every Friday night at 8 p.m. and in it we often look at these fish. The only problem is I do my live streams on a fairly inexpensive tablet that doesn't have the best quality camera, and I don't do any processing or anything. It just goes out live, and you wind up getting looks at these fish that are just not nearly as impressive as they should be, because these pearl gouramis are absolutely gorgeous in this tank. Otherwise, everything else is just rolling over. Nothing really going on in this tank. Angelfish is still looking good. All of my loaches down on the bottom are still looking good. My striped Raphael is still fat and happy sitting in there. He's facing away from us today, and we can see his tail sticking out of his little cave. That, of course, is my Angelicus Loach. You can see sitting right there. I only have one of those in this tank, but I do have several yo-yo loaches, and I've got some coolie loaches in here. There's one of the yo-yo loaches right now. And so this tank is also just sort of ticking over. Never really have much in the way of problems with this tank. The biggest problem I have with this tank is the way the algae grows on the glass. It grows back really fast. In fact, if you look here where my angelfish Cara is, this angelfish is named Cara. I have a few fish that have names, and this is one of them. But if you look right there on the glass in front of her, you can actually see some green algae that I must have missed last time I got in there and wiped the tank down. And so whatever that kind of algae is, it just grows in this tank really, really quickly. And within a few days, I'll have to get in there and wipe that glass down again. But otherwise, no issues with this tank at all. So moving on to my 55-gallon tank. Not much to talk about in this tank either. Just still sort of waiting to do something with this tank. I have made tentative arrangements to rehome the big Tenopoma that's in this tank. I'm sorry, I don't know why I called it a Tenopoma. The big pleco that's in this tank. I am thinking about my Tenopoma. We're going to be talking about that when we get over to that tank, but that's on the other side of the room, so hang on. We'll get there eventually. I do have a big pleco in this tank, and it is so big that it really should not be in this tank anymore. In fact, you can see that's its face right there, and its tail goes off into the back of the tank where we can't see it, but that's just its face and head right there. So quite large for a 55, but I do have somebody that wants it, and it's just going to be a matter of when we can get together and swap that fish out. So hopefully I will be getting a new angelfish from them at the same time I'm giving them this big pleco in here, so simultaneously be getting rid of a fish and also receiving one. So that'll be coming up hopefully within the next few weeks. So we'll see how that goes. Otherwise, I'm just kind of waiting to get that big fish out of the tank. Once I do that, we'll get in there, we'll start cleaning out some of this unruly vegetation, and we'll get the tank looking nice and cleaned up. We'll rescape it a little bit, and then we'll sort of rethink what we want to do with this tank, and maybe we'll spruce it up and put some new fish in there or something. So again, look forward to that. Coming down here to my 40 breeder. At the moment, this is the only real fish of note in the tank. It is another angelfish I got from the Petco this time. I really don't see any need to spend a ton of money on fancy, expensive angelfish when you can find some absolutely gorgeous ones at your local big chain store. You just have to be patient, and you just have to have a really, really good eye for waiting for the angelfish to come out. You can see where that rubber lip pleco on the back is making progress getting that wood all cleaned off. Look how beautiful that wood is where he's been scraping, and opposed to where all the other stuff has grown over onto it. You can see the same thing with the rocks. You can see the same thing on the woodwork over here. I have 2 rubber lip plecos in this tank, and then I have 4 Siamese algae eaters. And so between all them, not to mention all of my nearite snails that I have in here, they're doing a good job of getting this tank cleaned back up. So this angelfish is actually a temporary resident. The fish eventually is going to go into my New World tank here, but this New World tank has some fairly large and fairly aggressive fish in it, and we're not going to be putting that angelfish in there until it's grown out a little bit. That's all I'm really waiting for. So this tank is unusually subdued this morning. Everybody's chilling out. We got Flo, my spotted tilapia, back there in the corner. She is actually a West African fish. I know I call this my New World tank, but she is West African. I've got a bluegill sunfish named the Joker. And right behind the Joker, it's kind of hard to tell, but somewhere in there I have, oh nope, she's down the other end of the tank now. I have a jewel cichlid, which is also an African fish. I have, we might get to see it come out and make an appearance in just a second. It was swimming this direction, but it must have turned around underneath of the piece of woodwork. Somewhere under there I have a rainbow shark, which is an Indonesian fish. There it is, hiding in the back right there. So I have the Indonesian rainbow shark, and then everything else in here is a New World fish. I've got the silver dollars, I've got spotted silver dollars, I've got golden shiners, I've got a white suckerfish down there on the bottom that I caught myself. Of course, that bluegill sunfish I caught myself, and that is also a native fish. And there is my little jewel cichlid making an appearance. Again, this is an African fish, but a beautiful little fish. So there's some fairly large fish in here, and again, this sunfish, when it gets to be feeding time and it's been out and about for the day, that sunfish can be pretty aggressive. So I want to definitely make sure that angelfish is grown up to size before we bring it over and put it in such a large tank with so many large aggressive fish. But that is the plan eventually. That angelfish is going to be in this tank, and then we will do something else with that 40 breeder. I'm not entirely sure what we're going to do with it just yet, but we will do something. So having a look at my snail tank, not a lot to talk about here. I do have green water again. I do have some water clarifier. We're going to probably try to see if we can't get the green water out of there just by using a simple clarifier and maybe a water change or two, and we'll see what happens from there. But it's just a snail tank, so I don't really care. It's not a big deal. Moving on to my native tank. This tank originally had native gambusia that I caught myself, and I had some crayfish in here that I caught myself. The crayfish are technically invasive species in Maryland, but since I caught them myself right here locally, I considered it all to be native. But the crayfish escaped long ago, and I eventually added a bunch of redwag platies to this tank. And so while they are technically North American fish, they're not really native to my area, but whatever, I still call this my native tank. The water sprite on the top is growing out of control. We've got the Java Fern in here. I'm not even sure where I can see any of the Java Fern. I know I have Java Fern in here growing on the wood somewhere. Maybe it's gone now. But all of this water sprite, this is all attached to the wood. It's growing directly. It's, you know, again, this stuff is I'm tugging on that. That is rooted firmly to this piece of woodwork right here. So all this is water sprite. It's a type of fern. This is actually growing up out of the water in the back, and then the rest of it is grown attached to all this root here. This is Java moss. Maybe that's where I was saying Java fern. I meant to say Java moss. This is all Java moss. I put a big clump of it down here when I first got this, and it has grown all the way up through here. It's kind of hard to see, but all of that is Java moss in there. And all of that is growing on top of one huge piece of root mass that I went out and collected up one day. So let me reach in the back while we're here and get some of the snails off of the intake from the pump there. And we'll get the water flowing a little more. Oh, there we go. Now you can see I got the water flowing a little more effectively in there. And this big piece of pothos plant. Starts over here, the roots are mostly on this side of the tank. It goes around the back, it wraps around, comes around the front, comes all the way up, goes over, goes across, around, behind the waterfall tank, and then comes all the way back around. And if you saw all of this stuff when we were looking at the waterfall tank, that's where that piece ends. So that, in the waterfall tank, is actually a piece of pothos plant that gets its start all the way over there in my native tank. So moving on to my 125, think of this sometimes as my 125 Darrell. I sometimes think of this as my discus tank, but the playlist is technically my 125. So got a little bit of stuff going on in this tank that we need to talk about. The first thing I'm going to address very briefly, but then we're going to move on, is my Lavender Gourami. My Lavender Gourami is blown up like a balloon. I do not know how that thing is still alive. It has been weeks that I've been watching this thing get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it won't pass on. Every day I come down expecting to clear it out of the tank, and it's just still in there alive. So soon, hopefully, that fish will be out of our misery and I won't have to look at that poor thing anymore. But in the meantime, it's still in there and we're still dealing with that Lavender Gourami all bloated up. The other fish that I'm having an issue with in this tank has kind of gone to ground. It's hiding right now, doesn't surprise me. It is my Tenopoma that I mentioned earlier inadvertently. So the Tenopoma in this tank was getting a little bit bloated up. It was starting to swell up a little bit, not sure why, but that was starting to happen. And then as the scales started to sort of, pine cone out a little bit, I think there was some exposed, torn flesh or something underneath one of the scales, and I wound up getting an infection, and the fish has a little spot of fungal infection on its side, and I've been treating it with various medications so far to no avail. And I have a new medication that's on order. It'll be here Monday, and we're going to try that. So I got to wait at least 2 more days before I can get any more meds in the tank. But the nature of the injury is not immediately life-threatening or terribly concerning, so I'm not too worried about it. We're just going to let it ride till Monday. I'm going to keep plucking away at it and trying different medications. We're keeping the tank water nice and clean. I added a little bit of salt to take some of the stress off of the fish. And so far everything seems to be going okay. It's just not healing up properly, and so I haven't really found the right thing to get rid of that fungal infection. Otherwise, everything else in this tank is going swimmingly. All the other fish are doing really well. I did have a fungal infection on my angelfish back there not too long ago. I had a little injury on its face that wound up getting a little bit of an infection, and I got that cleaned up lickety-split with no problem, and that fish is now doing just fine. And again, everything else in the tank is turning over nicely. All the plants are doing well. I've actually probably got to get in here soon and divide up some of this crypt in the front. It's getting a little thick and bushy there. So I'll probably be doing that in the fairly near future too. So once again, I'll remind you, if you're subscribed, ring that bell. You won't miss any of these updates or notifications or anything else I've got going on here in my fish room. And don't forget, I do a live stream every Friday night, and those are always a lot of fun. So make sure you check them out. My 20-gallon blue ram tank, I just call this my 20-gallon tank, but it currently houses a German blue ram. It had 2 German blue rams in here, but unfortunately the female wound up jumping out of the tank. I found her on the carpet one morning, all dried up and fuzzy. And so she is no longer with us, but the male is still in there and he is still looking good. The tank itself is looking good. Everything in there is ticking over nicely. I planted some of this new fern. That's actually a new species of fern I bought fairly recently. I'm not sure what it's called, but it did say that it does better in vigorous current, like flowing water is where this fern thrives. And so I did put it right in front of the filter outlet, but that's not exactly vigorous flowing water. I mean, you can see how it's barely even, the fronds are barely even moving in the current. So I don't know if that's hindering it or what, but I mean, it's definitely growing. It has all the crud and stuff growing on the surface of the leaves, like many of my plants do. but they are also in there still growing well and thriving. And of course on that one you can see the difference between the clean leaves and this one especially. You can see the line down the middle where the nearite snails have cleaned this part of the leaf, but this part of the leaf was not cleaned by the nearite snails. And you can see the woodwork, how much the woodwork has been scraped clean. That's all nearite snails in there doing that. I don't have a whole lot in the way of other algae eating fish in this tank, so that's all nearite snails doing that for me. So that's my 20-gallon tank. If we have a look down here at my quarantine tank, it still has the light's not functioning properly. That's an LED retrofit into a fluorescent tube, and so it's not properly lighted. It's sort of about half dim, but it's only a quarantine tank. I don't know if you can tell, it's sort of flickering a little bit. I just haven't gotten around to doing anything with it. The only thing I did want to point out in this tank is that I currently have a hang on the back filter in there. I know it's hard to see through all the glare and everything, but I have this little tiny gap I have to work with to try to get back to where that filter is. So replacing the filter pads and all that kind of stuff, you know, you can just about make out where that filter is back there. It's kind of a pain in the butt. And so last night during my Friday night live stream, I went ahead and installed a sponge filter with an air stone in there, and so we're going to let that cycle in, and after it's been in there for a little while and I'm confident that there is some nitrifying bacteria established in that sponge, we're eventually going to go ahead and just remove that hang on the back filter out of here altogether, because it's just a pain in my butt, and we'll just switch over to having the sponge filter in there, since this is nothing more than quarantine tank. It's not really going to be that big of a deal for me. So moving over, last but certainly not least, let me get this forward light turned on here. I do have a switch down here that turns that forward fixture on. This is my, I call it my Brackish Tank, but I really think I need to change the name of the playlist to Butterbean's Tank, because while this tank was brackish once upon a time, it no longer is. I don't know why, but it really annoys me when you can just see that little bit of light shining out underneath. I put these pieces of cloth over top of my tanks to avoid all that light pollution and glare on my camera, and so when I come over here and there's that one little glaring beam of light that shines through that gap, it just really annoys me. I feel like I'm working against myself. Anyway, we got that taken care of, and this is Butterbean's tank. I just got in there and did some work. I'm finally starting to get it really cleaned up. All of the crud in there is finally going away. All of the brown diatom algae is going away. The cyanobacteria seems to be dying off. I'm not really sure why, but it just, everything in this tank just seems to have finally fallen over and is looking good. The Java Fern starting to turn green again. I recently added this big piece of Anubias in the front. And then of course Butterbean is also doing very well. I've reduced the salinity in this tank. We're at like 1.001 at this point. We have a little bit of mineralization in the water, but we are well below what would be considered brackish water at this point. And so again, I really feel like I should stop calling it my brackish tank, because that's going to give people the wrong impression. I was under the impression and the belief that these figure eight puffers really needed to be in brackish water, and for the first several years of Butterbean's life, he was in 1.008. I kept him in fairly high salinity for years, and he started developing these lesions all over his body. He was getting these weird white marks, and it looked like somebody was like scraping him or carving lines into his body. It looked really unpleasant. And so it was recommended that I reduce the salinity and see what happens, and so I tried it, and every time I reduced the salinity, he seemed to improve. And I've just continued that trend, and we've gone all the way down to, we're practically in fresh water at this point, and he looks better than he's looked since he was a young fish. And so we're definitely going to stay away from the brackish. And also, the more I've reduced the salinity of the water, the better the plants have done, the less of that red cyanobacteria I get, and the less diatom algae I get. So that salt water really does make it a lot more challenging to maintain the tank. So now that I've got it down to non-brackish water, we're just in fresh water here. everything seems to be going pretty well. So I am not going to mess with it. I'm going to keep the water reasonably fresh. I will add some mineralization to the water, but not a whole lot. I'm actually going to keep it, you know, in the realm of fresh water here. And then hopefully that will keep Butterbean alive and healthy for years to come. He's probably somewhere between 8 and 9 years old now. I don't think he's 10 yet, but he's getting close. He's getting up there. He's one of my earlier fish, believe it or not. I kind of jumped in with both feet and got a brackish fish fairly early on in the fish keeping hobby, and that was simply because I saw a tank full of figure-8 puffers down at my House of Tropicals. And I said, if I need to set up a brackish tank in order to keep some of those fish, I'm going to set up a brackish tank because I have to keep at least one of those fish. And I've never looked back. I've had a great, fantastic experience with Butterbean. Everybody loves him. He's super popular on my channel, and he is an awesome fish. I always say about puffers that they are about the closest thing you're ever going to get to having a puppy in an aquatic situation. They're very personable little fish. So there you go, everybody. We are back to where we started, more or less. We're not going to look at the waterfall tank again, but we are back to the 29 miscellaneous. So I'm going to say thanks for watching that one. Don't forget, as I keep mentioning, I do a live stream every Friday night. I do a members only live stream every Wednesday night. That's a private chat for my members only. So if you're interested in that, you can check out memberships. Otherwise, make sure you subscribe, ring that bell, all that good stuff, so on and so forth. YouTube stuff. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. I will see you on the next one.